I'm Lady Smith, Chair of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry. Today, I publish my 11th set of findings. They relate to the inquiry's case study looking into the provision of residential care in boarding schools. This volume concerns boarding for children at Morrison's Academy in Crieff between 1945 and 2007. I find that children who boarded at Morrison's were exposed to risks of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. For many, those risks materialised and children were abused. When boarding was established at Morrison's in 1880, if you had the ability to educate children, it was assumed you'd also have the skills to provide appropriate residential care for them. That was an erroneous assumption, and it prevailed for much of the time boarding existed at the school. It was assumed that children would be properly cared for if teachers and others were allowed to operate private boarding houses without a parent's supervision or oversight. That was not a safe assumption to make. Far too often, houses were poorly run and poorly managed by ill-equipped and untrained housemasters or housemistresses who lacked the necessary skills and allowed abuse to become endemic. Boarding houses were, until the 1990s, not subject to adequate oversight by the school management. They could operate as separate fiefdoms, where the character of the housemaster or mistress determined the character of the house, for good or ill. Personality and the school's reputation were prioritised over child protection. Recruitment practices and management of staff were lacking in the rigour they required. All three of the main boys' houses, Academy, Dalmore and Glen Earn, were places where cultures that were physically and emotionally abusive were allowed to flourish for lengthy periods between the 1950s and the 1980s. For decades, Morrison's harboured a culture of violence and emotional abuse. The abuse was primarily physical and emotional, but there was also sexual abuse. That abuse had long-term impact on those who experienced it. Factors such as the excessive and inappropriate use of corporal punishment, poorly run and managed boarding houses, and a strong tradition and culture of not reporting abuse were amongst those that resulted in children being abused and deprived of what could have been and should have been positive childhood experiences of boarding at the school. Some members of staff at Morrison's abused children both in the school and in the boarding houses. Corporal punishment was used excessively and inappropriately by staff. It was even used in advance of misbehaviour taking place. On occasion, teachers engaged in mass beatings. Morrison's response to excessive and inappropriate corporal punishment was, at the time, inadequate. Some children at Morrison's also engaged in abusive conduct towards other children. This included bullying and physical abuse, often a result of the common practice known as fagging. Corporal punishment, physical violence, and emotional abuse was also carried out by prefects. A few older pupils engaged in sexually abusive conduct against younger children in the boarding houses. Children were not encouraged to speak up or share concerns. No clyping was part of the culture, so children routinely did not clype. If they did do so, they suffered at the hands of their fellow pupils. In the course of the case study hearings, Morrison's offered a genuine apology for the abuse experienced by children entrusted into their care. Although they ceased taking boarders in 2007 and are no longer a boarding school, its recent leaders have sought to learn from the school's past failures in relation to child protection when it was a boarding school, and they continue to do so. Morrison's is one of a number of boarding schools investigated by the inquiry as part of the boarding school's case study. The abuse I find to have taken place at Morrison's is, in some respects, similar to the abuse I found to have taken place at Loreto and the boarding schools run by the Benedictines and the Marist brothers. My findings in relation to other boarding schools will follow. Finally, I'm very grateful to all who rose to the challenge of engaging with the inquiry, whether former pupils, former staff, or others. Their willingness to cooperate, assist, and contribute accounts of their experiences at Morrison's was welcome, and it was invaluable in the production of my findings.